The morning sun cast long shadows across the terminal at Dallas International Airport as hundreds of passengers moved through the busy corridors with their luggage rolling behind them. Flight 447 to Los Angeles was scheduled to depart at 9:30, and the gate area was already crowded with business travelers checking their phones and families trying to keep their children entertained. Nicole Bryant stood in line at the premium boarding lane with her small carry-on bag and a leather briefcase that had belonged to her father. She was dressed casually in dark jeans and a soft gray sweater, because she had learned long ago that comfortable clothing made long flights more bearable. Her hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail and she wore minimal makeup. To anyone watching, she looked like any other young professional heading to the West Coast for work. The gate agent scanned her boarding pass and welcomed her aboard with a smile. Nicole walked down the jet bridge and entered the aircraft where a flight attendant named Claire Martinez greeted passengers as they boarded. Claire was a woman in her early 30s with kind eyes and a professional demeanor that came from years of working in customer service. She directed Nicole toward the first-class cabin, and Nicole found her seat in 2A by the window. She settled in and pulled out a business magazine from her briefcase. The article she was reading discussed leadership challenges in family-owned companies, and she found herself nodding along with several of the points the author made. As more passengers boarded, the cabin began to fill up. A businessman took the seat across the aisle, and an elderly couple settled into the row behind Nicole. The atmosphere was quiet and calm as people stowed their bags and got comfortable for the flight. Nicole glanced out the window at the ground crew loading luggage into the cargo hold below. She had made this same flight dozens of times over the past year, but she never grew tired of watching the organized chaos that happened before every departure. Captain Derek Mason emerged from the cockpit about 15 minutes before scheduled departure. He was a tall man in his mid-40s with graying hair at his temples and the confident stride of someone who had been flying commercial aircraft for many years. Derek had joined the airline shortly after Nicole's father had expanded operations to the West Coast, and he took pride in his perfect safety record and his seniority among the pilot staff. He liked to do a walkthrough of the first-class cabin before each flight, because he believed it showed passengers that their captain cared about their experience. He would greet travelers with a firm handshake and a reassuring smile that conveyed competence and authority. Derek started at the front of the cabin and worked his way back row by row. He shook hands with the businessman and asked the elderly couple if this was their first time flying to Los Angeles. They chatted pleasantly for a moment before Derek moved on. When he reached row 2, he paused and looked down at Nicole with an expression that was harder to read. His smile remained, but something in his eyes had changed. He cleared his throat and Nicole looked up from her magazine. "Good morning," Derek said in a voice that carried through the cabin. "I need to see your boarding pass, please." Nicole kept her expression neutral and reached into her jacket pocket where she had tucked the paper boarding pass. She handed it to Derek without saying anything. He took it from her and studied it for what seemed like a long time. His eyes moved from the printed information to Nicole's face and back again. Other passengers were starting to notice the interaction, and a few of them glanced over with curiosity. "This is a first-class ticket," Derek said slowly, as if he was explaining something complicated to a child. "These seats are quite expensive. Are you sure you checked in for the right flight?" Nicole felt the familiar tightness in her chest that came whenever she encountered this kind of situation. She had experienced it in hotels and restaurants and even in the offices of her own company, before people realized who she was. She took a quiet breath and kept her voice steady and calm. "I am in the correct seat," she said. "That is my boarding pass and my assigned seat." Derek continued to hold the boarding pass and he tilted his head slightly as if considering whether to believe her. "I just want to make sure there has not been some kind of error," he said. "Sometimes people accidentally select the wrong fare class when they book online. It happens more often than you would think. I would be happy to help you relocate to economy class if there has been a mistake. No one would be upset about an honest error." The words hung in the air and Nicole could feel eyes on her from every direction. The businessman across the aisle had lowered his newspaper and was watching with a frown. The elderly woman behind Nicole leaned forward and spoke up in a sharp voice. "Excuse me, Captain, but I think you are being inappropriate. This young lady clearly has a valid ticket, and you are embarrassing her in front of everyone." Derek turned to the elderly woman with a patient smile that did not reach his eyes. "Ma'am, I appreciate your concern, but I am simply following standard security procedures. It is my responsibility to ensure that all passengers are in their correct seats." He turned back to Nicole and his voice took on a tone of exaggerated patience. "Miss, I really think it would be best if we verify this with the gate agent. It will only take a moment and then we can get everyone settled properly." Claire Martinez had been watching from the galley and she stepped forward with a worried expression. "Captain Mason, I scanned her boarding pass when she came aboard and everything was in order. There is no problem with her ticket." Derek waved his hand dismissively without looking at Claire. "I would like to verify it myself, Claire. Please call the gate agent and ask them to come aboard." Claire hesitated for just a moment and Nicole could see the conflict playing out on her face. The flight attendant clearly knew that something was wrong with this situation, but she also knew that challenging a captain in front of passengers was risky. Claire finally nodded and picked up the phone near the aircraft door. She spoke quietly into the receiver and then hung up. "The gate agent is on his way," she said softly. The cabin had gone completely silent. No one was reading or checking their phones anymore. Everyone was watching Derek and Nicole and waiting to see what would happen next. Nicole sat perfectly still with her hands folded in her lap. Her magazine lay forgotten on the empty seat beside her. She did not argue or protest or raise her voice. She simply waited with the same calm expression she had worn since Derek first approached her. She had learned long ago that sometimes the most powerful response was no response at all. Derek stood in the aisle holding Nicole's boarding pass like it was evidence of a crime. He rocked back slightly on his heels with his other hand resting on his belt. To anyone watching, it was clear that this was not really about verifying a ticket or following security procedures. This was about something else entirely, and everyone in that first-class cabin knew it. The gate agent appeared in the aircraft doorway less than 2 minutes later. His name was Kevin, and he looked to be in his early 20s with the nervous energy of someone still relatively new to his job. He walked quickly down the aisle toward where Derek stood, and Nicole could see the confusion on his face. Kevin had checked in dozens of passengers for this flight, and he had not received any alerts about ticketing problems or seating issues. Claire met him halfway and whispered something that Nicole could not hear, but Kevin's expression shifted from confusion to concern. "Captain Mason," Kevin said as he approached. "Is there a problem?" Derek handed him Nicole's boarding pass with a gesture that suggested he was presenting evidence. "I need you to verify that this passenger is supposed to be in first class," Derek said. "I want to make absolutely certain there has not been an error with her ticket." Kevin took the boarding pass and pulled out his handheld scanner from his belt. He ran the barcode under the red light and waited for the information to load on the small screen. Nicole watched his face carefully and saw the exact moment when he realized what was really happening. Kevin's eyes widened slightly and he looked from the scanner to Derek and then to Nicole. His expression was a mixture of embarrassment and disbelief. "The ticket is valid," Kevin said in a voice that was louder than necessary. "Nicole Bryant is booked in seat 2A in first class. The ticket was purchased 3 weeks ago, and the payment was processed without any issues. There is absolutely no problem with this passenger or her boarding pass." Derek's jaw tightened and a muscle in his cheek twitched. He took the boarding pass back from Kevin and looked at it again, as if hoping the information might have changed. "I see," he said finally. "I was just making sure we were following proper protocols. You can never be too careful with security these days." Kevin stood there for a moment looking like he wanted to say something more, but he simply nodded and handed Nicole's boarding pass back to her, instead of to Derek. "I apologize for any inconvenience, Miss Bryant," Kevin said with genuine sincerity in his voice. "I hope you have a pleasant flight." Nicole took her boarding pass and gave Kevin a small smile. "Thank you," she said quietly. Kevin turned and walked back toward the exit, and Claire followed him. Nicole could see them talking near the doorway, and Claire's face was flushed with anger or embarrassment or both. Derek remained standing in the aisle for several more seconds. The elderly woman behind Nicole made a disapproving sound with her tongue, and the businessman across the aisle shook his head slowly. Derek seemed to notice the hostile atmosphere for the first time, and he cleared his throat again. "Well," he said to no one in particular, "I was just doing my job. Security is everyone's responsibility." No one responded, and Derek finally turned and walked back toward the cockpit. His stride was not quite as confident as it had been when he first entered the cabin. Nicole watched him disappear through the cockpit door, and then she carefully folded her boarding pass and put it back in her pocket. Her hands were steady, but her heart was racing. She had been in situations like this before, but it never got easier. Every time it happened, she felt the same mixture of anger and sadness and exhaustion. Claire returned to the first-class cabin and approached Nicole's seat. She crouched down in the aisle so she could speak quietly without the other passengers hearing every word. "Miss Bryant, I am so sorry about what just happened," Claire said, and her voice was thick with emotion. "That was completely inappropriate and unacceptable. I want you to know that I told him your ticket was valid, but he insisted on calling the gate agent anyway." Nicole looked at Claire and saw genuine distress in the flight attendant's eyes. "It is not your fault," Nicole said gently. "You tried to help, and I appreciate that." Claire bit her lip and glanced toward the cockpit. "I have worked with Captain Mason before, and he can be difficult sometimes, but I have never seen him act like this. Would you like me to bring you something to drink?" "It is on me." Nicole shook her head. "Oh, thank you, I'm fine. I just want to get to Los Angeles." Claire nodded and stood up, but she hesitated before moving away. "If you want to file a complaint, the airline takes these things very seriously," Claire said. "I would be happy to provide a statement about what I witnessed." "I will think about it," Nicole said, though she had already made up her mind about what she was going to do. Claire gave her one more apologetic look before heading back to her duties. The boarding process continued, and the final few passengers made their way to their seats in economy class. The captain's voice came over the intercom with the standard welcome message and safety information. Derek's voice sounded perfectly normal and professional, as if nothing unusual had happened. He informed everyone that the flight time to Los Angeles would be approximately 3 hours and 40 minutes, and that they should expect smooth flying conditions. Nicole put her earbuds in and closed her eyes as the plane pushed back from the gate. She focused on her breathing and tried to let go of the tension that had built up in her shoulders and neck. The aircraft began its taxi toward the runway, and she felt the familiar acceleration as they prepared for takeoff. Within minutes, they were airborne and climbing through the clouds. Nicole opened her eyes and looked out at the land falling away below them. From this height, everything looked peaceful and orderly. The businessman across the aisle leaned toward her once the seatbelt sign had been turned off. "Excuse me," he said, and Nicole removed one earbud. "I just wanted to say that what happened before takeoff was disgraceful. My name is Gregory, and I fly this route at least twice a month for business. I have never seen a captain behave that way toward a passenger." Nicole managed a small smile. "Thank you for saying that. Unfortunately, it is not the first time something like this has happened to me." Gregory's face showed genuine shock. "That is terrible. I hope you will report it to the airline. People like that captain should not be in positions of authority if they are going to treat customers with such disrespect." "I am considering my options," Nicole said carefully. She was not ready to reveal who she was or what kind of action she planned to take. Gregory seemed like a kind man, but Nicole had learned to be cautious about sharing too much information with strangers. "Well, if you need a witness, I saw the whole thing," Gregory offered. He pulled out his business card and handed it to Nicole. "I would be happy to provide a statement if it would help." Nicole took the card and thanked him. Gregory settled back into his seat and returned to his newspaper. Nicole put her earbud back in, but she did not close her eyes again. Instead, she pulled out her phone and opened her notes app. She began typing a detailed account of everything that had happened from the moment Derek Mason approached her seat. She included the exact words he had used and the tone of his voice and the way he had dismissed Claire's attempt to correct him. She noted the time and the flight number and the names of everyone who had been involved. When she finished typing, Nicole opened her messages and sent a brief text to someone whose contact name was simply listed as office. The message read, "Issue on Flight 447 will discuss when I land." Nicole hesitated and then added, "This one cannot be ignored." The response came back almost immediately. "Understood. I will have the conference room ready." Nicole put her phone away and pulled out her laptop from her briefcase. She had work to do, and sitting here dwelling on Derek Mason's behavior would not change anything. What mattered now was what happened next, and Nicole intended to make sure that something did happen. She opened a spreadsheet and began reviewing quarterly revenue reports, but her mind kept drifting back to the look on Derek's face when he had questioned her ticket. It was not just skepticism she had seen there. It was assumption and prejudice dressed up as concern for proper procedures. The plane lifted off the runway and climbed steadily into the clear blue sky. Nicole sat quietly in her seat, her laptop open in front of her. The documents on her screen showed financial reports and operational summaries, but her mind kept drifting back to what had just happened. She had experienced discrimination before, but it never got easier. The sting of being judged by the color of her skin rather than her character remained sharp, no matter how many times it occurred. Claire moved through the first-class cabin with practiced efficiency, offering drinks and snacks to the passengers. When she reached Nicole's row, she paused and lowered her voice. She asked if Nicole needed anything at all, her tone apologetic and kind. Nicole looked up and smiled gently. She thanked Claire and requested just a glass of water. Claire nodded and hurried away, returning moments later with the water and a small package of cookies that Nicole hadn't asked for. It was a small gesture, but Nicole appreciated it nonetheless. The passenger seated next to Nicole, a man in his late 50s named Gregory, had been watching the exchange. He wore an expensive suit and had the confident air of someone accustomed to business travel. He cleared his throat and turned toward Nicole. He apologized for what had happened during boarding, saying he found the pilot's behavior completely unacceptable. Nicole thanked him for his kindness and said she appreciated his concern. Gregory shook his head and explained that he had been flying with this airline for nearly 20 years and had never witnessed anything like that before. Nicole took a sip of her water and replied that unfortunately, this was not her first experience with such treatment while traveling. Gregory's expression darkened with genuine dismay. He asked if she planned to file a complaint with the airline. Nicole's lips curved into a slight smile. She said she would definitely be addressing the situation, though perhaps not in the way most passengers would. There was something enigmatic in her tone that made Gregory curious, but he sensed she didn't want to elaborate, so he didn't push further. The conversation shifted to lighter topics. Gregory mentioned he was traveling to Los Angeles for a series of business meetings. He asked what brought Nicole to the West Coast. She explained she had some company matters to attend to, keeping her answer deliberately vague. They talked about the weather, the differences between Dallas and Los Angeles, and their favorite restaurants in both cities. It was pleasant small talk, the kind that made long flights pass more quickly. Meanwhile, in the cockpit, Derek sat in the captain's seat, his hands steady on the controls. Beside him, his co-pilot Chris monitored the instruments and maintained radio contact with air traffic control. The flight was proceeding smoothly, with clear skies and minimal turbulence. Derek should have been content, but instead he was irritated. He began complaining to Chris about passengers who were too sensitive and always looking for reasons to be offended. Chris listened uncomfortably, his eyes focused on the control panel. He was only 28 years old and had been flying commercially for just 3 years. Derek was a senior captain with an impressive record, and Chris didn't want to create conflict. But he also knew what he had witnessed during boarding was wrong. He had seen the way Derek spoke to that woman, the condescension dripping from every word. It had made Chris deeply uncomfortable, and he had been relieved when the gate agent confirmed the woman's ticket was valid. Derek continued his monologue, saying that people needed thicker skin, and that everyone was too quick to claim discrimination these days. He insisted he had just been doing his job, making sure all passengers were in their correct seats. It was a security issue, he claimed, nothing more. Chris nodded occasionally but said very little. He wondered if he should report what happened, but he worried about the consequences. Derek had friends in high places within the airline, and Chris was still building his career. Back in the cabin, Nicole had returned her attention to her laptop. She was reviewing the quarterly performance reports for the airline, noting areas where customer satisfaction had dipped slightly and operational costs had risen. She made notes in the margins, questions to ask her executive team during their next meeting. Her father had taught her that success in business required attention to detail and a willingness to address problems directly. She had inherited not just his company but also his philosophy of leadership. Gregory glanced over and noticed the complex spreadsheets on Nicole's screen. He commented that she must work in finance or business management. Nicole nodded and said something like that, her tone pleasant but non-committal. She appreciated Gregory's friendliness, but she wasn't ready to reveal her identity to anyone on this flight just yet. She wanted to see how the situation would unfold naturally, without the influence of people knowing who she was. The flight attendants continued their service, moving efficiently through the cabin. Claire kept a watchful eye on Nicole, still feeling terrible about what had occurred. She had worked for the airline for 7 years and took pride in providing excellent customer service. What Derek had done violated everything she believed about treating passengers with respect and dignity. She hoped the woman would file a complaint, though she knew many passengers simply wanted to forget unpleasant experiences and move on with their lives. As the plane cruised at 35,000 feet, Nicole closed her laptop and looked out the window. The clouds below formed a white blanket that stretched endlessly in all directions. She thought about her father and how he had built this airline from nothing. He had started with a single plane and a dream of making air travel accessible and enjoyable for everyone. He had always said that an airline was only as good as its people, and that treating employees and customers well was the foundation of success. Nicole had taken over the company 5 years ago, when her father passed away suddenly from a heart attack. She had been working in the business for years by then, learning every aspect from the ground up. Her father had insisted she start at entry-level positions, working as a baggage handler, gate agent, and even flight attendant before moving into management roles. He wanted her to understand the company from every perspective, to appreciate the hard work of every employee. It was a lesson she had never forgotten. Now, as the majority owner and head of the airline, Nicole took her responsibilities seriously. She believed in her father's vision and worked hard to maintain the high standards he had established. But she also knew that no company was perfect, and problems could develop over time if leadership wasn't vigilant. What happened today suggested there might be deeper issues within the organization that needed addressing. Nicole pulled out her phone and sent a brief text message to her executive assistant. She instructed him to arrange a meeting with the Human Resources Director and the Chief Operating Officer for later that afternoon at the Los Angeles headquarters. She didn't provide details, just said it was urgent and required immediate attention. Her assistant responded within seconds, confirming the meeting was scheduled. Gregory noticed Nicole using her phone and smiled. He mentioned that he could never fully disconnect from work either, even at 35,000 feet. Nicole laughed softly and agreed that modern technology made it impossible to truly get away. They talked for a few more minutes before Gregory pulled out his own laptop and began working on a presentation. The remainder of the flight passed quietly, and Nicole divided her time between reading and thinking about how to handle the situation with Derek. She wasn't interested in simply punishing one pilot. She wanted to understand if this was an isolated incident or part of a larger pattern. She wanted to know if other employees had experienced or witnessed similar behavior. And most importantly, she wanted to make sure her airline was living up to the values her father had established all those years ago when he first opened for business. The plane began its descent into Los Angeles, and the flight attendants moved through the cabin collecting cups and napkins. Nicole fastened her seatbelt and put away her laptop. The landing was smooth, and within minutes the aircraft was taxiing toward the gate. Passengers around her began gathering their belongings, eager to deplane and continue with their day. Nicole remained seated, taking her time and making no effort to rush. Claire noticed that Nicole was among the last passengers still seated in first class. She approached and asked if everything was all right. Nicole looked up and smiled warmly. She assured Claire that everything was fine and thanked her for the excellent service during the flight. Claire felt a wave of relief mixed with continued guilt. She mentioned that she hoped Nicole would consider flying with them again, despite what had happened. Nicole's smile widened slightly. She said she definitely planned to fly with this airline again very soon, and there was something in her voice that Claire couldn't quite interpret. Before standing to leave, Nicole pulled out her phone and made a quick call. Claire was nearby, organizing items in the galley, and she couldn't help but overhear parts of the conversation. Nicole spoke quietly but clearly, confirming that she had landed and would be at the office in about 20 minutes. She mentioned Flight 447 specifically and said they needed to discuss what had occurred. The call lasted less than a minute, and then Nicole ended it and gathered her small carry-on bag. Derek had already left the aircraft through the flight deck door, following the usual procedure for pilots. He walked through the terminal with Chris, discussing their schedule for the next few days. They had 2 days off before their next assigned flight, and Derek was looking forward to relaxing at home. He had completely dismissed the incident with the passenger from his mind, or perhaps he simply didn't care enough to dwell on it. These things happened, he told himself, and people were too sensitive anyway. Chris walked beside him but remained mostly quiet. The younger pilot was still troubled by what he had witnessed. He kept thinking about the woman's face, how calm and dignified she had remained despite Derek's obvious disrespect. He wondered if he should say something to someone in management. but he worried about being labeled a troublemaker or damaging his relationship with the senior pilots who could influence his career advancement. They stopped at a small coffee shop in the terminal, and Derek ordered his usual espresso while Chris got a regular coffee. They sat at a small table near the windows overlooking the tarmac. Derek scrolled through his phone, checking messages and sports scores. He seemed completely at ease, chatting about an upcoming football game and his plans to do some work on his boat over the next 2 days. Chris nodded along but couldn't shake the uneasy feeling in his stomach. Nicole, meanwhile, had exited the aircraft and made her way through the terminal. Instead of heading toward baggage claim or the taxi stand like most passengers, she walked purposefully toward a different section of the airport. She approached a secure door marked with a small sign that read, "Authorized personnel only." A security guard stood nearby and his face brightened with recognition when he saw her approaching. He greeted her respectfully by name and told her they were expecting her in the boardroom. He opened the door and Nicole stepped through into the executive corridor. The airline's corporate offices occupied several floors of the airport building, a convenient arrangement that allowed executives to stay closely connected to daily operations. Nicole walked down the familiar hallway, her shoes clicking softly on the polished floor. She passed administrative assistants and junior managers, several of whom recognized her and nodded politely. She returned their greetings but didn't stop to chat. She had important business to attend to, and time was of the essence. Back in the terminal, Claire finished her post-flight duties and headed to the crew lounge. She was scheduled for a routine meeting with her supervisor, something that happened every few months to discuss performance and any concerns. She expected it to be quick and uneventful, but when she arrived at the lounge, the atmosphere felt different. Her supervisor, Patricia, was waiting for her with an unusually serious expression. Patricia asked Claire to come into a private office, and Claire's heart began to beat faster. Once the door was closed, Patricia sat down and looked at Claire directly. She explained that a complaint had been filed regarding Flight 447, and she needed Claire to provide a detailed account of everything that had happened, from the moment passengers began boarding until they deplaned in Los Angeles. Claire felt her mouth go dry. She asked if this was about the incident with the captain and the passenger in first class. Patricia nodded and pulled out a notebook, ready to take notes. Claire took a deep breath and began describing what she had witnessed. She explained how Derek had approached the passenger and asked to see her boarding pass in a way that seemed suspicious and targeted. She described his tone, which had been condescending and dismissive, and how he had suggested the woman might be more comfortable in economy class, despite having a valid first-class ticket. Claire mentioned that she had tried to tell Derek the ticket was fine, but he had ignored her and called for the gate agent. Patricia listened carefully, writing notes and occasionally asking clarifying questions. She wanted to know if Derek had behaved this way with any other passengers. Claire thought for a moment and said no, just with that one woman. Patricia asked if Claire had noticed anything else unusual about Derek's behavior. Claire hesitated, then admitted that Derek could sometimes be difficult to work with and didn't always listen to flight attendants' input, but this was the first time she had seen him treat a passenger so disrespectfully. The interview continued for nearly an hour. Patricia asked about the other passengers' reactions, whether anyone had spoken up and how the situation had been resolved. Claire answered every question honestly, though she felt uncomfortable potentially getting a colleague in trouble. She explained that the gate agent had confirmed the woman's ticket was completely valid, but Derek hadn't apologized. He had simply walked away, muttering about doing his job. When the interview finally concluded, Patricia thanked Claire for her honesty and cooperation. She assured Claire that she had done nothing wrong and had handled the situation professionally. Claire asked what would happen next, but Patricia said she couldn't discuss the details of the investigation. She told Claire to continue with her regular duties and not to discuss this matter with other crew members. Claire nodded and left the office feeling drained and anxious. In the executive boardroom, Nicole sat at the large conference table with her executive assistant Marcus and the director of human resources, a capable woman named Helen. Nicole recounted the entire incident in detail, her voice calm but firm. She described Derek's behavior, his tone, his refusal to accept that her ticket was valid, and his complete lack of apology even after being proven wrong. Helen listened with growing concern, taking careful notes. Marcus had already pulled Derek's employment file and placed it on the table. Nicole opened it and began reviewing his history with the airline. He had been employed for 15 years and had a mostly clean record in terms of flight safety and technical performance. However, as Nicole dug deeper, she noticed a few complaints scattered throughout his file. 2 passengers had reported feeling disrespected by him in previous years, though the complaints had been marked as resolved with no detailed follow-up. Helen explained that in the past, complaints against pilots had sometimes been handled less rigorously than complaints against other employees. Pilots were harder to replace due to the extensive training and certification required, and there had been a tendency to give them more leeway. Nicole's expression hardened. She said that policy ended immediately. Every employee, regardless of position, would be held to the same standards of professionalism and respect. Nicole instructed Helen to launch a full investigation into the incident. She wanted security footage reviewed, statements taken from other passengers and crew members, and a complete examination of Derek's history with the airline. She also wanted to know if there had been other complaints that weren't properly documented or addressed. Helen nodded and said she would begin immediately. Marcus suggested they also review the airline's training programs and policies regarding discrimination and customer service. Nicole agreed. She said this incident had revealed potential systemic problems that needed to be addressed company-wide, not just with one individual employee. If Derek's behavior had been allowed to continue unchecked for years, that suggested failures at multiple levels of the organization. The meeting lasted another hour as they discussed the investigation timeline and the steps that would be taken. Nicole made it clear that she wanted this handled thoroughly but also quickly, and she wanted answers within 48 hours at most. The investigation moved forward with remarkable speed and efficiency. Helen assembled a small team consisting of herself, 2 senior human resources specialists, and the airline's legal counsel. They worked through the evening and into the next day, methodically gathering evidence and conducting interviews. The first step was reviewing the security footage from Flight 447, and what they saw confirmed everything Nicole had described. The video clearly showed Derek approaching Nicole's seat with a demeanor that was markedly different from how he had greeted other first-class passengers. His body language was aggressive, his gestures dismissive. The audio quality was good enough to capture most of the conversation, and his condescending tone was unmistakable. When he suggested Nicole would be more comfortable in economy class, several nearby passengers visibly reacted with shock and discomfort. The footage also showed Claire attempting to intervene and Derek waving her off impatiently. Helen's team contacted the gate agent Kevin, who came in for an interview the following morning. He sat nervously in the conference room, clearly worried about being in trouble. Helen assured him he had done nothing wrong and simply needed to provide his account of what happened. Kevin relaxed slightly and explained that Derek had called him to the aircraft, claiming there was a problem with a passenger's ticket. When Kevin arrived and scanned the ticket, everything was perfectly valid and properly paid for. Kevin said he had been confused by Derek's insistence that something was wrong because the ticket clearly showed a legitimate first-class purchase made weeks in advance. He had told Derek this directly, but the captain had seemed annoyed rather than relieved. Kevin had apologized to the passenger and left, feeling embarrassed about the entire situation. He mentioned that he had considered filing a report about the incident, but wasn't sure if it was his place to do so. Helen thanked Kevin for his cooperation and told him his detailed account was very helpful. She made notes about his willingness to report the incident and his professional handling of an awkward situation. After Kevin left, the team moved on to contacting passengers who had been seated in first class during the flight. They had a manifest with contact information and began making calls. 3 passengers agreed to provide statements. The first was Gregory, the businessman who had sat next to Nicole. He spoke candidly about what he had witnessed, describing Derek's behavior as completely inappropriate and discriminatory. He said he had flown hundreds of times and never seen a pilot treat a passenger that way. He mentioned the woman had handled the situation with remarkable grace and dignity, and he hoped the airline would take serious action. The second passenger was an elderly woman named Dorothy, who had been seated across the aisle. She had actually spoken up during the incident, telling Derek his behavior was inappropriate. She told the investigator that she was appalled by what she witnessed and felt the pilot's actions were clearly motivated by racial prejudice. She said the whole situation had made her uncomfortable for the entire flight, and she had been considering whether to continue flying with the airline. The third passenger was a younger man named Stephen, who had been seated a few rows back. He corroborated the accounts of the others, adding that several passengers had discussed the incident quietly among themselves after Derek left the cabin. There had been a consensus that the pilot's behavior was unacceptable, and at least 2 other passengers had mentioned planning to file complaints when they landed. Helen and her team compiled all these statements into a comprehensive report. They also conducted a deeper review of Derek's employment history, looking beyond the official file to interview flight attendants and other crew members who had worked with him over the years. What they discovered was troubling. While Derek was technically competent as a pilot, multiple flight attendants reported that he could be difficult and dismissive, particularly toward female crew members and younger staff. One flight attendant named Rachel had worked with Derek numerous times over the past 5 years. She explained that Derek often ignored safety concerns or suggestions from flight attendants, acting as though their input was irrelevant. She said most attendants tried to avoid being scheduled on his flights because he made the work environment tense and unpleasant. Rachel admitted she had never filed a formal complaint because she worried it wouldn't be taken seriously and might negatively impact her career. Another crew member, a young flight attendant named Lisa, shared a similar experience. She recalled a flight 6 months earlier when she had tried to inform Derek about a passenger who appeared intoxicated and potentially disruptive. Derek had dismissed her concerns without even looking at the passenger, telling her to handle it herself. The situation had escalated, requiring intervention from other passengers, and Lisa had felt unsupported and undermined. The investigation team also discovered that Derek had received complaints from passengers on at least 3 previous occasions over the past 8 years. In one case, a Hispanic family had complained that Derek had been rude and dismissive when they asked questions about the flight. In another instance, a young black man had reported feeling profiled when Derek questioned whether he should be sitting in the business class section. The third complaint came from a Muslim woman who felt Derek had treated her with suspicion and hostility. What was most disturbing about these previous complaints was how they had been handled. In each case, the complaint had been noted in Derek's file, but there had been no serious investigation or consequences. The responses had been minimal, usually just a brief conversation with Derek where he denied any wrongdoing and claimed he was simply doing his job. The complaints had then been marked as resolved, with no follow-up or pattern recognition. Helen prepared a detailed timeline showing the progression of complaints and incidents over Derek's 15-year tenure. When she presented it to Nicole the following afternoon, the pattern was unmistakable. Derek had a long history of treating certain passengers and crew members with disrespect, particularly people of color and women. The airline had failed to recognize this pattern or take meaningful action to address it. Nicole sat in her office reviewing the report with a mixture of anger and disappointment. She was angry at Derek for his behavior, but she was equally frustrated with the organizational failures that had allowed this to continue for so long. Her father had built this airline on principles of respect and equality, and somewhere along the way those values had been compromised, at least in how complaints were handled. Helen sat across from Nicole and waited for her reaction. Finally, Nicole looked up and spoke. She said the evidence was clear and overwhelming, and Derek's employment needed to be terminated immediately. But she also said this couldn't be just about one pilot. The investigation had revealed systemic problems in how the airline handled discrimination complaints and managed employee behavior. Those problems needed to be fixed. Nicole instructed Helen to schedule a meeting for the following morning with Derek and the full executive team. She wanted Derek to be given the opportunity to respond to the evidence, though she had little doubt about what the outcome would be. She also wanted to begin developing new policies and training programs to prevent this kind of situation from happening again. Helen nodded and said she would make all the necessary arrangements. That evening, Derek was contacted and asked to come to the corporate headquarters the next morning for a meeting. The message was deliberately vague, stating only that it concerned Flight 447 and required his immediate attention. Derek agreed to come, though he was puzzled by the request. He assumed maybe there had been a minor incident he wasn't aware of, or perhaps some routine procedural matter that needed clarification. Chris, the co-pilot, was also contacted for an interview. He came in that same evening and sat nervously with one of the human resources specialists. He was asked to describe Derek's behavior during and after the boarding incident. Chris hesitated at first, clearly uncomfortable speaking negatively about a senior colleague. But when he was assured that his statement would be kept confidential and would help the investigation, he opened up. Chris described Derek's comments in the cockpit about passengers being too sensitive and always looking for reasons to be offended. He explained how Derek had characterized his behavior as simply doing his job and ensuring security protocols were followed. Chris admitted he had been uncomfortable with the entire situation and had considered reporting it but had worried about the professional consequences. He said he was relieved someone else had filed a complaint because he had been struggling with whether he had a responsibility to speak up. Derek arrived at the airline's corporate headquarters the next morning expecting a routine meeting. He wore his pilot's uniform and carried himself with the confident air of someone who had been with the company for 15 years. He checked in with the receptionist and was directed to the executive conference room on the top floor. As he rode the elevator up, he wondered briefly what this was about but felt no particular concern. He had dealt with administrative matters before, and they were usually resolved quickly. When the elevator doors opened, he walked down the hallway and entered the conference room. What he saw made him stop in his tracks. The large table was surrounded by serious-looking executives. He recognized Helen from Human Resources, Leonard, the Chief Operating Officer, and several other senior managers he had seen but rarely interacted with. But what truly shocked him was seeing the woman from Seat 2A sitting at the head of the table, now dressed in an elegant navy blue business suit. Derek's face lost color. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. He looked around the room, trying to understand what was happening. Leonard gestured to an empty chair and asked Derek to please sit down. Derek moved mechanically, his confident demeanor completely shattered. He sat down slowly, his eyes still fixed on Nicole. She regarded him with the same calm, composed expression she had worn during their encounter on the plane. Leonard cleared his throat and began speaking. He said they were here to discuss serious allegations regarding Derek's conduct on Flight 447 from Dallas to Los Angeles 2 days earlier. He then made formal introductions, though his tone suggested Derek should already know who everyone was. When he got to Nicole, he paused for emphasis. He explained that this was Nicole Bryant, majority shareholder and owner of the entire airline, who had inherited the company from her late father, Charles Bryant. Derek felt his stomach drop. The woman he had humiliated, the woman whose ticket he had questioned and whose presence in first class he had challenged, owned the airline. He tried to speak, but his voice came out as barely a whisper. He stammered something about not knowing who she was. Nicole spoke for the first time, her voice steady and professional. She said that was precisely the point. Passengers should be treated with respect regardless of who they are. And what happened on Flight 447 demonstrated a fundamental failure of that principle. Leonard took over again and explained that they had conducted a thorough investigation into the incident. He said they had reviewed security footage, interviewed multiple witnesses including passengers and crew members, and examined Derek's complete employment history. He asked Derek if he remembered the incident in question. Derek nodded weakly. He said he had been checking tickets as part of his routine pre-flight duties and ensuring all passengers were seated correctly. Nicole leaned forward slightly. She asked if that was truly all he had been doing. Derek hesitated and then said yes, he was just making sure everything was in order for safety and security reasons. Nicole's expression didn't change, but there was steel in her voice when she spoke next. She asked why he had singled her out when other first-class passengers had not been questioned about their tickets. She asked why he had suggested she would be more comfortable in economy class even after seeing her valid boarding pass. Derek tried to defend himself. He said he questioned passengers sometimes when something seemed off and it was nothing personal. He claimed he was being thorough because first-class tickets are expensive, and sometimes people make mistakes during online booking. Nicole asked him directly if he had questioned any of the other first-class passengers that day. Derek fell silent. He knew he hadn't, and lying would only make things worse. Helen opened a folder and began presenting the evidence. She described the security footage in detail, noting Derek's body language, tone, and the specific words he had used. She read from the transcripts where Derek had suggested Nicole relocate to economy class, and where he had dismissed Claire's attempts to inform him the ticket was valid. She then presented statements from Kevin the gate agent, from Gregory and Dorothy and Stephen the passengers, and from Claire the flight attendant. The weight of evidence was overwhelming. Derek sat in his chair looking smaller and smaller as each piece was presented. He tried to interrupt several times to explain or justify his actions, but Leonard asked him to please wait until all the evidence had been presented. When Helen finally finished, the room fell silent for a moment. Then Leonard asked Derek if he had anything to say in response to these allegations. Derek took a shaky breath and tried to mount a defense. He said he had been with the airline for 15 years and had an excellent safety record. He claimed he had never meant to offend anyone and was simply trying to do his job properly. He suggested that maybe his approach had been too direct or his tone had been misunderstood, but there had been no discriminatory intent. He looked around the room searching for sympathetic faces but found none. Nicole let him finish and then spoke again. She said the evidence clearly showed this was not simply a case of being too direct or having poor communication skills. She noted that he had treated her differently than other passengers and had refused to accept that her ticket was valid, even after being told so by both a flight attendant and a gate agent. She pointed out that he had never apologized, even after being proven completely wrong. Helen then revealed the most damaging part of the investigation. She explained that this was not an isolated incident. She presented the timeline showing 3 previous complaints from passengers over the past 8 years, all involving similar patterns of disrespectful treatment toward people of color. She also shared statements from flight attendants describing Derek's dismissive and sometimes hostile behavior toward crew members, particularly women and younger staff. Derek's face turned red. He protested that those previous complaints had been investigated and resolved. He said he had explained what happened in each case and the matters had been closed. Helen responded that the complaints had been noted but not properly investigated, and that was part of the larger problem the airline needed to address. She said a pattern of behavior had emerged that could no longer be ignored. Leonard took over the conversation again. He said that based on the evidence and the pattern of behavior over multiple years, the executive team had decided Derek's employment with the airline would be terminated effective immediately. Derek's eyes went wide with shock and anger. He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. He said this was completely unfair and that he was being made a scapegoat. He accused them of overreacting to one incident because the passenger happened to own the company. Nicole remained seated, her expression unchanged. She said this decision had nothing to do with who she was personally and everything to do with his conduct and the airline's values. She explained that any passenger deserved to be treated with dignity and respect, and Derek had violated that fundamental principle repeatedly over the years. She added that the airline had failed by not addressing this pattern sooner, but that failure ended now. Derek began to argue more forcefully. He said 15 years of service meant something and couldn't be thrown away over a misunderstanding. He claimed he had rights and would fight this decision. Leonard calmly explained that Derek was being given the option to resign voluntarily, which would look better on his employment record and make it easier for him to find another position. He said the alternative was immediate termination for cause, which would be noted in his permanent record. Derek refused. He said angrily that he wouldn't resign because that would be admitting he did something wrong, and he maintained he had simply been doing his job. His voice grew louder and his face redder. He pointed at Nicole and said she was destroying his career because of some perceived slight that he never intended. Nicole finally stood up, her composure never wavering. She said his career was ending because of his own choices and actions, not because of anything she had done. Leonard signaled to the security officer who had been waiting outside. Derek was informed that his access credentials would be deactivated immediately, and he would be escorted from the building. He would receive information about his final paycheck and benefits by mail. Derek looked around the room one last time, his expression a mixture of anger and disbelief. He grabbed his jacket and walked toward the door, muttering angrily under his breath about lawyers and wrongful termination. As Derek left with the security officer, the room remained quiet for several moments and the tension slowly began to ease. After Derek's departure, Nicole remained standing at the head of the table. The other executives sat quietly, waiting to see what would happen next. The confrontation had been difficult but necessary, and everyone in the room understood they had just witnessed a turning point for the airline. Nicole took a deep breath and looked around at the faces watching her. She knew that terminating Derek was only the first step in addressing much larger problems. She asked everyone to remain for an extended meeting because there was much more to discuss. Leonard nodded and settled back in his chair. Helen had her notebook ready, and the other executives pulled out their own materials. Nicole returned to her seat and began speaking in a clear, measured voice. She said what had happened with Derek was symptomatic of deeper, organizational failures that needed immediate attention. She pointed out that Derek's behavior had been allowed to continue for years despite multiple complaints. She asked Helen to explain why those previous complaints had not been properly investigated or addressed. Helen admitted that historically, the airline had treated pilot complaints differently than complaints against other employees. There had been an assumption that pilots were difficult to replace due to extensive training requirements and FAA certification processes, so management had been more lenient with them. Nicole's expression hardened. She said that policy ended immediately, and that every employee, regardless of position, would be held to the same standards of professional conduct and customer service. She emphasized that technical competence was important, but could never excuse discriminatory behavior or disrespect toward passengers and colleagues. The airline her father built was supposed to treat everyone with dignity, and that value had been compromised. Leonard spoke up and acknowledged that the leadership team bore responsibility for allowing these systemic problems to develop. He said they had been so focused on operational efficiency and financial performance that they had neglected the cultural and human elements that truly defined the company. Nicole appreciated his honesty but made it clear that acknowledgement alone was not enough. They needed concrete action and meaningful change. She outlined several immediate priorities. First, all discrimination complaints would now be investigated by an independent committee that included representatives from human resources, legal counsel, and employee advocates. No complaint would be dismissed or minimized, and every investigation would be documented thoroughly. Second, there would be mandatory diversity and sensitivity training for all employees, with special emphasis on leadership positions and customer-facing roles. Third, the airline would establish a new system for collecting anonymous feedback from flight attendants and other crew members about pilot behavior and working conditions. This feedback would be reviewed quarterly, and any patterns of concern would trigger immediate investigation. Fourth, there would be a comprehensive review of all existing employee files to identify any other cases where complaints had been inadequately addressed. Helen was taking rapid notes, occasionally asking clarifying questions. The legal counsel, a woman named Diane, raised a concern about potential liability from the previous mishandled complaints. She said families of passengers who had complained might have grounds for lawsuits if they learned their concerns had been ignored. Nicole considered this seriously, and then said they would deal with any legal consequences honestly and transparently. Covering up past failures would only make things worse. The meeting continued for another 3 hours as they worked through the details of the new policies and procedures. Nicole insisted on specific timelines and accountability measures. She wanted the diversity training program designed and ready to launch within 6 weeks. She wanted the independent complaint committee established within 2 weeks. She wanted the crew feedback system operational within a month. The executives scrambled to take notes and assign responsibilities. One of the operations managers, a man named Philip, asked how they would communicate these changes to employees and the public. He worried about negative publicity if news of Derek's termination became public. Nicole considered this carefully and then said they would be proactive and transparent. They would announce the policy changes as part of a broader commitment to excellence and inclusivity, and if questions arose about specific incidents, they would address them honestly without violating employee privacy. She also decided they would establish a passenger advocacy office where travelers could report concerns directly to trained specialists who would ensure every complaint was taken seriously and investigated properly. This office would operate independently from regular customer service and would have direct reporting lines to the executive team. Helen suggested they hire an outside consultant to help design this office and ensure best practices were followed. The meeting finally concluded late in the afternoon. Everyone left with clear assignments and tight deadlines. Nicole remained in the conference room for a few minutes after everyone else had gone, looking out the window at the airport below. Planes were taking off and landing in a steady rhythm, carrying thousands of passengers to destinations around the world. She thought about her father and wondered what he would think of what had happened and how she was handling it. Over the next several days, word of Derek's termination spread through the pilot community and the airline staff. Reactions were mixed. Some pilots expressed concern that management was being too harsh and that anyone could be fired for a minor incident. Others, particularly female pilots and pilots of color, quietly expressed relief that the airline was finally taking discrimination seriously. Several flight attendants privately thanked Helen for conducting a thorough investigation. Chris, the co-pilot who had flown with Derek, felt conflicted. Part of him was relieved that he had spoken up during the investigation, but he worried about how other pilots would view him if they knew he had provided a statement against Derek. Helen assured him that witness statements were confidential, but Chris knew how quickly rumors spread in close-knit professional communities. He decided to focus on his own conduct and make sure he always treated passengers and crew members with respect. Claire received a personal call from Nicole thanking her for her professionalism during the incident and her honesty during the investigation. Nicole asked if Claire would be interested in helping develop the new training programs for flight attendants, particularly focusing on how to handle discrimination and customer service issues. Claire was surprised and honored by the offer. She said she would absolutely be interested and would do whatever she could to help improve the airline's culture. Nicole also personally contacted Gregory, Dorothy, and Stephen, the passengers who had provided statements during the investigation. She thanked them for taking the time to speak up and assured them their feedback had led to meaningful changes. Gregory was impressed by her personal attention and said he would definitely continue flying with the airline. Dorothy said she was pleased to hear about the policy changes and appreciated being kept informed. Stephen simply thanked her for taking the situation seriously. The Passenger Advocacy Office was established within 3 weeks, faster than originally planned. Nicole hired an experienced advocate named Karen, who had previously worked in civil rights organizations. Karen brought fresh perspective and wasn't afraid to challenge existing practices. She immediately began reviewing past complaint files and identifying cases that needed to be reopened or revisited. What she found was disturbing but not surprising. Dozens of complaints over the years had been inadequately handled or dismissed. The diversity training program was designed by a consulting firm that specialized in workplace culture and discrimination prevention. The program was comprehensive and included not just classroom sessions, but also scenario-based training and ongoing assessment. All employees were required to complete it, starting with executives and senior management to demonstrate leadership commitment. Some employees approached it cynically at first, but many found the training genuinely valuable and eye-opening. Nicole herself participated in the training alongside other executives. She wanted to lead by example and show that no one was above the need for continued learning and improvement. During one session, a consultant asked participants to share experiences where they had witnessed or experienced discrimination. Nicole shared her story from Flight 447, describing how it had felt to be judged and humiliated based on her appearance. Several employees were visibly moved, and the discussion that followed was honest and productive. The new complaint investigation process was put to the test within the first month. 2 passengers filed discrimination complaints, one involving a gate agent and another involving a flight attendant. Both complaints were immediately assigned to the independent committee, which conducted thorough investigations. In one case, the complaint was substantiated and the employee received formal discipline and additional training. In the other case, the investigation found no evidence of discrimination, but it identified communication issues that were addressed through coaching. News of the airline's policy changes eventually reached the media, though not in the way Philip had feared. A business journalist writing about corporate leadership and accountability. The interview was published in a major business magazine 3 months after the incident on Flight 447. Nicole spoke candidly about what had happened, though she never mentioned Derek by name. She focused instead on the systemic changes the airline had implemented and her commitment to building a culture of respect and accountability. She talked about her father's vision for the airline and how she was working to honor his legacy while also modernizing the company's approach to employee relations and customer service. The article generated significant attention. Many readers praised Nicole's transparency and willingness to acknowledge past failures, while taking concrete action to address them. Some critics argued that the airline should have caught these problems earlier and questioned why it took an incident involving the owner to trigger change. Nicole addressed these criticisms directly in follow-up interviews, agreeing that the airline should have done better and emphasizing that the new policies were designed to ensure problems would be caught and addressed regardless of who was affected. The publicity had an unexpected positive effect on the airline's business. Customer satisfaction scores began to improve as passengers noticed a genuine shift in service quality and employee attitudes. Applications for flight attendant and pilot positions increased, with many applicants specifically mentioning the airline's commitment to diversity and respect as factors in their decision to apply. Several industry analysts noted that the airline was becoming a model for how companies should handle discrimination and workplace culture issues. Nicole took a more active, day-to-day role in airline operations than she had before the incident. She instituted a practice of regularly flying on the airline's routes, sometimes revealing her identity, and sometimes traveling anonymously to get an unfiltered view of the passenger experience. Other executives began doing the same, and this practice became formalized as part of the company's quality assurance program. Employees knew they might encounter senior leadership at any time, which encouraged consistent professionalism. Claire flourished in her new role helping to develop training programs. She worked closely with Karen from the Passenger Advocacy Office to create realistic scenarios that flight attendants might encounter. The training emphasized not just following rules but understanding the spirit behind them and recognizing how unconscious bias could affect interactions with passengers. Claire drew on her own experience from Flight 447, using it as a teaching example of how to speak up when witnessing inappropriate behavior. The feedback system for crew members proved valuable in identifying both problems and opportunities for improvement. Flight attendants and other staff members submitted regular anonymous reports about their experiences, and patterns were carefully analyzed. Several pilots received coaching after multiple reports indicated communication issues or dismissive behavior. A few pilots, like Chris, received commendations for creating positive working environments and treating crew members as valued colleagues. 6 months after the incident, the airline held a company-wide meeting to review the changes that had been implemented and discuss ongoing challenges. Nicole stood before hundreds of employees gathered in a hotel ballroom and spoke about the journey the company had been on. She acknowledged that change was difficult and that some employees had struggled with the new expectations. But she also celebrated the progress they had made and shared statistics showing improvements in customer satisfaction, employee morale, and operational efficiency. She told them about letters she had received from passengers thanking the airline for excellent service and respectful treatment. She read from one letter written by an elderly black man who had flown frequently for decades and said this was the first time he had ever felt truly welcomed and valued by an airline. There wasn't a dry eye in the room when she finished reading. Nicole emphasized that this was why their work mattered and why the changes they had made were so important. The Independent Complaint Committee had investigated 47 cases in its first 6 months of operation. Some complaints were substantiated and resulted in discipline or termination, while others were found to lack merit. But every single case was thoroughly investigated and documented, and both complainants and accused employees received fair hearings. The transparency and consistency of the process began to build trust among employees and passengers alike. Karen's Passenger Advocacy Office became a model that other airlines began to study and emulate. She published a report detailing the types of complaints the office had received and the systemic issues they revealed. The report was honest about the airline's past failures, but also highlighted the progress being made. Other companies in the travel industry reached out asking for guidance on setting up similar programs. Nicole continued her practice of occasionally flying anonymously, and each trip provided valuable insights. On one flight, she noticed a gate agent going out of her way to help an elderly passenger who was confused about the boarding process. Nicole later sent a personal commendation that was added to the employee's file. On another flight, she observed a pilot conducting the pre-flight walkthrough and greeting every passenger warmly regardless of their class of service. She made a note to recognize that pilot during the next company meeting. The culture shift was not without challenges. A few veteran employees resisted the changes and complained that the airline was becoming too politically correct. Several chose to leave the company, and while Nicole regretted losing experienced staff, she also recognized that not everyone would embrace the new direction. She remained firm in her conviction that respect and professionalism were not optional values. 1 year after the Flight 447 incident, Nicole sat in her office reviewing the airline's annual performance reports. Revenue was up, customer satisfaction scores had reached record highs, and employee turnover had decreased significantly. The airline had won several industry awards for customer service and workplace culture. But what pleased Nicole most were the stories she heard from employees and passengers about positive experiences and meaningful interactions. She received a letter from Claire describing how the training program had helped her feel more confident speaking up when she witnessed problems. Claire wrote that she had recently intervened when a pilot was being dismissive toward a young passenger, and the pilot had actually thanked her afterward for the feedback. Claire said the culture really had changed, and she was proud to be part of the airline. Nicole also heard from Chris, who had been promoted to captain after demonstrating excellent leadership and interpersonal skills. He wrote to thank her for creating an environment where doing the right thing was valued and supported. He said he thought about the Flight 447 incident often and was grateful he had found the courage to speak up during the investigation. Gregory, the businessman who had sat next to Nicole on Flight 447, became a regular customer and occasional informal advisor. He would send Nicole notes when he observed something particularly good or bad during his travels, and she appreciated his honest feedback. He told her that in his decades of business travel, he had never seen a company transform its culture as quickly and thoroughly as her airline had. Dorothy, the elderly passenger who had spoken up during the original incident, sent Nicole a heartfelt letter saying she was proud of the changes the airline had made. She wrote that standing up to Derek that day had been frightening, but felt necessary, and she was glad it had led to something positive. She said she now flew exclusively with the airline because she knew her dignity would be respected. Nicole instituted quarterly meetings with employees at all levels to discuss challenges and opportunities. These sessions were genuine conversations, not corporate presentations, and employees appreciated the opportunity to speak directly with leadership. Problems were identified and addressed quickly, and good ideas from frontline staff were often implemented. The airline also established scholarship programs for employees pursuing additional education and created clear career advancement paths for people in all positions. Nicole believed that investing in employees would pay dividends in service quality and company loyalty, and the results proved her right. Employees who felt valued and respected passed that positive energy on to passengers. On the first anniversary of the Flight 447 incident, Nicole decided to take a flight to Dallas and back. She booked a first-class ticket under her own name and dressed professionally. When she arrived at the gate, the agents recognized her and greeted her warmly. She smiled and thanked them, but asked to be treated like any other passenger. They nodded understanding. As she boarded the aircraft, the captain was standing in the cabin greeting passengers. His name was Daniel, a veteran pilot she had met at several company events. He greeted each passenger with genuine warmth, making eye contact and offering a sincere welcome aboard. When he reached Nicole, he smiled and said he was honored to have her flying with them today. She thanked him and said she was confident she was in good hands. Nicole settled into her seat and looked around the cabin. The flight attendants moved efficiently and cheerfully through their duties. Passengers of all backgrounds sat together comfortably. The atmosphere was relaxed and pleasant.